There is a kind of loneliness that money cannot fix. In fact, if you have ever been around real wealth, not the kind you see on social media, but the kind that lives behind private gates and says very little, you already know that money has a way of making loneliness worse. It magnifies it. It gives it marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of a city that belongs to you on paper, but never quite feels like yours on the inside. That is the kind of loneliness that James Calloway knew better than most. And it is the reason that one rainy Thursday morning in October, one of the wealthiest men in Chicago stepped off a city bus with a used paperback in his jacket pocket and walked 3 blocks to a coffee shop he visited, not because he needed the coffee, but because it was the one place in his life where no one knew his last name. She thought she was falling in love with a broke man, a man who took the bus, a man who ate ramen from a paper cup and genuinely apologized for not being able to afford the nicer restaurant on the corner, a man who wore the same faded jacket 3 weeks in a row and never once seemed embarrassed about it, and for 8 months she loved him anyway. What she did not know, what no one in that coffee shop knew, what no one in her entire world knew, was that the man she was walking past security guards with owned the entire building they were standing in. He owned the block, he owned the development on the next street, and somewhere across the city, in a glass tower with his name etched quietly into the lobby floor, 300 people showed up to work for him every single morning. By the end of this video, you will understand why one of the wealthiest men in Chicago chose to pretend he had nothing. You will understand what he was looking for, what it cost him, and what happened the day the woman he loved found out the truth. Stay with us. Because this story is not about money. It never was. Before we go any further, let us ask you something, and we want you to sit with it honestly. If you found out that the person you were falling in love with had been lying to you about who they were, not about their past, not about a mistake, but about the very foundation of their life, would you stay? Would the love you had built on what you thought was solid ground still feel real? Or would the ground itself crumble underneath you? These are the questions at the heart of this story, and they are questions that a woman named Nicole Carter had to face in the worst possible way, not with a gentle conversation over dinner, not with a careful confession on a quiet evening, but with a photograph, a newspaper photograph, of the man she thought she knew. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let us go back to where this story really begins. Not with James Calloway the billionaire, but with James Calloway the boy, because you cannot understand what he did and why he did it without understanding what wealth took from him long before he was old enough to know what was happening. James Calloway grew up in Naperville, Illinois, in a house that was always slightly too big for the family inside it. His father, Richard Calloway, had built Calloway Development Group from nothing, a one-man operation started in a rented office above a dry cleaner on the edge of town, funded by a small loan and an enormous amount of stubbornness. By the time James was 8 years old, his father's name was on buildings across the Chicago metro area. By the time James was 12, his father had a car he never drove, a watch he never looked at, and a marriage that was slowly becoming a formality. Richard Calloway was a builder by trade, but the one thing he could never quite build was a life that felt like his own. James watched all of it. He watched his father's friendships change as the money grew, the old ones falling away one by one, replaced by people who always seemed to need something, people who laughed too loudly and too quickly at every joke, people who were always subtly angling toward the next favor. He watched his mother's unhappiness deepen even as the house got larger. He watched his father rise earlier and stay later, and come home looking like a man who had been slowly hollowed out and had learned to live comfortably with the emptiness, and James filed all of it away. Not with bitterness. James was never a bitter child, but with a kind of quiet, clear-eyed understanding of what money could do to a person if you let it become the whole of who you were. He told himself that when his time came, he would do things differently. He had no idea what that would actually cost him. At 28, James graduated from Northwestern with a degree in finance and joined his father's company. He was sharp and he worked hard, and the people around him respected him in the particular way that people respect someone who is good at what they do and does not make a performance of it. At 31, Richard Calloway suffered a stroke, minor, mercifully, but enough to make him step back. James stepped forward. Almost overnight, he became the public face of Calloway Development Group, and almost overnight, everything changed in the ways he had always feared it would. The calls he received changed. The way people looked at him in a room changed. Women who had never given him a second glance suddenly found him fascinating, and James was not naive enough to think that was a coincidence. Old college acquaintances resurfaced with brilliant investment opportunities that needed just a small amount of capital to get off the ground. Every dinner felt like an audition. Every conversation had a current of calculation running underneath it, that James could feel the same way you feel. A change in weather before the clouds arrive. He was 31 years old, and he felt, for the first time in his adult life, as though he had disappeared inside his own name. He dated. He was handsome and successful, and he moved in circles where those two things together opened doors without anyone even reaching for the handle. But every relationship he entered carried the same weight from the very beginning. Every woman already knew who he was before she knew him. There was a version of James Calloway that existed in the world in newspaper articles and industry profiles and photographs from charity events, and that version always arrived in the room before he did. He ended each relationship quietly, without drama, and each time the loneliness settled back in a little heavier than before. And then one morning in early October, on the way to a meeting he was already tired of before it started, James Calloway did something that had no strategic purpose and made no business sense at all. He got off the bus 3 stops early and walked into a coffee shop he had never been to before. He ordered a black coffee. He sat down at a small table by the window. He opened his book, and for 40 minutes, not a single person in that room treated him like anything other than a man sitting alone with a book and a coffee. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. Nicole Carter was 32 years old and had been teaching 4th grade at Lincoln Elementary School on the north side of Chicago for 7 years. She was the kind of teacher that parents requested specifically, and administrators quietly relied on, to hold the emotional center of a building. Together, her students made her handmade cards at the end of every year, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. Her colleagues brought her their problems because she had a way of listening that made you feel understood before she had said a single word in that response. She was sharp and warm and had a laugh that her younger sister once described, accurately, as the kind that could embarrass you in a quiet restaurant and make you not care even slightly. She had been in one serious relationship in her adult life, 4 years with a man named Derek, who was charming and confident, and who turned out, in the 4th and final year, to have been living a life alongside their relationship that Nicole knew nothing about. It rarely is. It was a text message she saw by accident, a conversation she was not supposed to overhear, and then the slow and suffocating unraveling of everything she had believed was solid. She did not shout or break things. She packed a bag, moved into her sister's apartment for 6 weeks, cried in the right amounts, and then got back to her life with the quiet practicality that characterized almost everything she did. But she took one thing from that experience that she carried forward like a stone in her pocket. One absolute, unbreakable rule. She had no room left in her life for anything that was not real. The coffee shop was called Grounds, and it sat on a corner 2 blocks from Lincoln Elementary. Nicole had been going there every weekday morning for 3 years. She had a standing order, and she knew every barista by name. She graded papers there on Friday afternoons when the school emptied out. It was her place, in the specific way that a regular in a neighborhood spot claims a corner of it without ever being asked to. So when a man in a faded jacket sat down at the table next to hers one Tuesday morning and accidentally rattled her coffee cup reaching across the wood table, not spilling it, just startling her enough that she grabbed it and then said, with complete unperformed sincerity, "I am so sorry. I am genuinely a disaster before 10 in the morning." She laughed. Not politely. Actually laughed. And that was the beginning. His name, he told her, was James. He came in most mornings. He was between things professionally, that was how he put it, and Nicole, who was not a woman who pressed, did not ask for more than he offered. They talked about the book he was reading, then about the book she was reading, then about the neighborhood and the cold that year, and nothing in particular. By the time she checked her phone, the morning was nearly gone and she was going to be late. She left in a hurry and forgot her scarf on the back of the chair. He held on to it. She came back the next morning and they talked for another 40 minutes. And that was the second day. He asked her to dinner in the 3rd week. He chose an Italian place 8 blocks away, the kind with plastic menus and red checkered tablecloths, and a house wine list that was 3 items long. He ordered the second cheapest bottle without consulting her or apologizing for it, which Nicole noticed and quietly approved of. He asked her about her students with the kind of attention that made it clear he was not asking to fill space. She told him about a boy in her class named Marcus, who had started crying during a reading lesson and could not or would not explain why, and James sat with that for a moment before he said, he probably understood it more than he had words for. Nicole looked at him for a second longer than she intended to. Over the months that followed, they built something real. He met her for coffee on the mornings her schedule allowed it. She cooked dinner at her apartment on Saturdays, and he ate 2 full portions and asked what she had put in it. They walked along the lakefront on a Sunday in November, when the wind off the water was genuinely punishing and neither of them suggested turning back. He fixed the wheel on her bicycle on a Saturday afternoon, kneeling on her kitchen floor with a wrench he had bought that morning specifically for the task, and she watched him from the counter with a mug of tea and felt something settle in her chest that she had almost forgotten the feeling of. He lived in a small, clean apartment on the west side. Very little furniture. Books on the counter he was in the middle of. She picked them up sometimes and read the passages he had underlined, not the obviously beautiful sentences, but the ones that were quietly, sideways true. She was falling in love with him. She knew it, and she let it happen. For Nicole Carter, that was not a small thing. There were moments, if she had been looking for them, that might have caught her attention. A phone call he stepped outside to take, described briefly afterward as work. A friend who recognized him in a restaurant and greeted him with an odd formality before James redirected the conversation. His name appearing briefly in a headline on an open laptop screen one evening, too quickly for her to read it. She was not looking for those things. She had no reason to be. She trusted him the way you trust someone who has given you, day after day, nothing to doubt. In late January, Nicole arrived at school on a Monday morning to find a letter pinned to the staff notice board. Lincoln Elementary School, which had served the North Side community for over 60 years, was under immediate threat. A commercial development company had acquired the properties surrounding the school, and the city had opened a rezoning consultation that, if approved, would force the school's closure within 18 months. The letter was careful and professional. The reaction in the staff room was not. Nicole stood in that room that afternoon and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. She thought about Marcus. She thought about 60 years of a neighborhood institution. She thought about the children whose parents had attended that school before them. That evening, she told James everything. She sat at her kitchen table with her hands around a mug and explained the situation, the development, the rezoning timeline, the way one company in particular seemed to be driving the entire push in that section of the North Side. She pulled up the news article on her laptop and turned it toward him so he could read. She said the name of the company, Calloway Development Group. James went very still. He looked at the screen. He looked at the headline he had approved in a boardroom 3 months earlier without anyone on his team thinking to check what was 3 blocks east of the proposed development boundary. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said he was sorry. And he said it in a way that meant something larger and more complicated than Nicole understood at the time. He said he had an early morning. He went home. Over the following 2 weeks, Nicole felt a shift in him without being able to name where it was coming. From he was present when they were together, but there was a tension underneath the surface of him, a weight she could feel without being able to locate it. She did not push. She watched. And then one morning in February, her phone lit up with a text from her sister. One link. No message. The Chicago Tribune. The headline read, Calloway Development reverses North Side rezoning application in surprise decision. Lincoln Elementary School was safe. The development had been pulled with no public explanation, at significant financial cost to the company. And there, in the third paragraph, was a photograph. A man in a suit shaking hands outside a city office. A caption underneath. James Richard Calloway. Chief Executive Officer, Calloway Development Group. Estimated net worth, $400 million. She did not call. She did not text. She walked to his apartment, the small one on the west side that she had visited a dozen times, and thought she understood and knocked on the door. He opened it. He looked at her face. He understood immediately that the time for managing this situation had passed. She held up her phone with the article open, his photograph facing outward, and she did not shout. That is what James said later, to the one person he ever told the full story to. He had braced himself for anger. She gave him something harder than anger. She stood in the doorway, and she was completely quiet. She looked at him the way you look at something you are trying to memorize before it is gone. She asked one question. Was any of it real? And then James Calloway told the truth for the first time, in longer than he could properly account for. He told her about his father. about the particular loneliness that extreme wealth constructs around a person over time, so gradually that you barely feel the walls going up, until the day you realize you cannot see out, about the relationships that felt like negotiations, about the morning he got on a city bus with a paperback in his jacket pocket and felt, for the first time in years, like a man rather than a balance sheet, about the coffee shop, about her scarf on the back of the chair, about how each week he told himself he would tell her the following week, and how the longer he waited the more impossible it became, because the silence had grown into something so heavy that the truth felt like it would destroy everything, even though he knew, every single morning, that the truth was the only right thing. He told her about the school. He told her that he had not known it was there when the initial acquisition plan was drawn up, that when she described the children, described Marcus, described what 60 years of that building meant to that neighborhood, he went back the next morning and pulled every map and every impact report and stood in his office for a long time, looking at what his company had been about to do. He told her that reversing the application had cost the company several $1,000,000 in planning fees and contracted commitments, that he had made the decision without informing his board in advance and had spent 3 days managing the professional consequences. He had not told her, because there was no version of the sentence that did not require him to first say, "I am not who you think I am." And by the time the school situation arrived, the distance between who she thought he was and who he actually was had become so vast that he could not see a way across it. Nicole listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she picked up her coat from the back of the chair. She said goodnight. She closed the door behind her. Very quietly, James did not reach out during the 3 weeks that followed. He went back to his office and his glass tower and his city view, and he sat inside the life he had spent years trying to escape, and felt the full weight of it settle around him. The loneliness was still there. It had just changed shape. It was no longer the loneliness of being surrounded by people who wanted things from him. It was the loneliness of having found the one person who wanted nothing, and having damaged that beyond what he could calculate. Nicole spent those 3 weeks going back through everything they had shared. Not searching for more deception, she found none. She was looking at the architecture of what they had built together, and asking herself what was real inside it. The conversation about Marcus on their first dinner, the bicycle wheel on the kitchen floor, the passages he underlined in his books, the way he had listened to her from the very first morning, as though what she was saying mattered to him before he had any possible reason to perform that it did. She thought about the school, about the fact that reversing that decision had cost him real money, had created real professional difficulty, and he had done it without telling her, without using it as leverage, without ever mentioning it. And she thought about what that meant when you stripped everything else away, whatever the lie had been, and it had been significant. She was not pretending otherwise. The actions underneath the lie told a different story. And Nicole Carter had spent enough of her life paying attention to know the difference between what a person says and what a person does when no one is watching. She called him on a Wednesday evening. He answered before the second ring. She said she wanted to meet at grounds, same table. He said he would be there. She arrived first. He came through the door in the same faded jacket. She noticed, and she let herself notice it without deciding in advance what it meant, and sat down across from her. 2 coffees on the table. She looked at him for a moment, and then she said, "You still owe me an honest answer about what you actually thought of that film we watched in January, because I could tell you were being polite the entire time, and it drove me absolutely crazy." And he laughed, a real laugh, the kind that arrives before you have a chance to manage it. And she picked up her coffee, and that was enough. They took it slowly after that. There was no grand gesture and no dramatic moment of public reconciliation. James introduced himself to her properly, in stages, not as a headline or a net worth, but as himself, piece by piece, in the way that people who have not been fully known before sometimes have to learn to allow. He took her to the real apartment one evening in March. She stood in the lobby of his building and looked down at the letters in the floor, Calloway, and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I genuinely cannot believe you have been riding the bus this whole time when you own a building with an underground parking garage." He said, "The bus is faster at rush hour." She said, "That is almost certainly not true." And they went upstairs. Here is what this story is actually about. It is not about a wealthy man deceiving a woman for his own entertainment. If you walked away from everything we have just told you with that reading, we want you to go back. It is about what happens when a person possesses so much of one thing that they lose access to something far more fundamental, the experience of being known without a reason behind it. James Calloway did not lie to Nicole Carter out of cruelty or manipulation. He lied to her out of a longing so specifically human that it is almost impossible to argue with, even if the method of it was wrong. He wanted to be seen, not the version of him that existed in newspaper captions and industry profiles and the careful expressions of people who needed something from him. The version of him that fixed a bicycle wheel on a kitchen floor because someone he cared about needed it fixed. And Nicole Carter, who had every right to close the door and not open it again, who had been deceived before and knew exactly what that cost, chose to look at the whole of a person rather than only the part that had failed her. That is not a simple thing. In a world that moves fast and judges faster, that kind of choice requires a form of courage that does not get celebrated the way it should. The courage to ask, what did this person actually do when no one was watching? What did they protect when protecting it cost them something real? What remained true about them underneath everything that was not? Those answers do not come from a headline. They come from paying attention. And here is the question we want to leave you with today. Not a verdict, not a judgment. Just this. Who in your life knows the version of you that has nothing to prove? The one that takes the bus even when it is inconvenient. The one that fixes the bicycle. The one that underlines the quiet sentences in the book. If you have that person, hold on, because that kind of being known is rarer than any address or net worth ever will be. Now we want to hear from you. If you were Nicole, would you have forgiven James? Or is the deception the end of the story, no matter what reason sits behind it? There is no wrong answer here. Drop it in the comments and let us know where you stand. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe if you have not already, because the next story coming to this channel is one that is going to stay with you even longer. Thank you for watching.